Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the Surface, Challenging Violent Politeness and Predatory Inclusion. My name is Tawabich Gannett Stewart, and I am going to be moderating the discussion this evening with three phenomenal Black women I have had the pleasure of working with. They have done some phenomenal work in our community, and they continue to do great work in our community. And before we dive in, I just want to say to those of you who are going to be listening today, that open your hearts, open your minds. Some of the things that you may hear today may make you feel uncomfortable. They may make you feel defensive, but we are here to have some honest, raw conversation about what systems do to us, particularly Black women, particularly Black families. I've spent many years in Florida's child welfare system, and this is a system that really is more accurately described as a family policing system. And I have seen over the years the harm that this system can cause to children, to their parents, to the employees that are working within this institution. This is the last week of April, this Child Abuse Prevention Month. For those of you who work closely with these systems, you probably have attended events over the last few weeks, proclamations, and maybe attended events where speakers have highlighted some of the things that you can do to help prevent abuse, or they may talk about what some believe the harm that parents are causing to their children. I would dare say that there probably have not been as much discussion about the harm that this system inflicts on children, on families, and on the employees that work within within the institution. And this is just one of many institutions that interface with our Black family. So what you're going to hear today is relevant and applies to other institutions that interact with our family. So without further ado, this is just going to be a very informal, casual conversation. We're going to start off with introductions. I'll ask for each of our panelists to spend a couple minutes just introducing themselves. Tell us about what you do, what is in your heart, what is your passion. So we're going to kick it off with Dr. Elizabeth Hordge-Freeman.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to be sharing this space with these panelists. So I'm Elizabeth Hordge-Freeman. I'm an associate professor of sociology and chair of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of South Florida. And I want to preface my comments by saying all of the comments and opinions that I share today are my own, and they do not represent the University of South Florida, which is my employer until July 1st of this year, where I'll be leaving USF. In terms of my research, my passions, and the connection that it has to Black women, what I'll say is that every publication, every book I've written, every article that I've written has centered Black women and Black families, both in the US and really around the world. So I'm what is referred to as a transnational sociologist. So I speak Spanish and Portuguese. And so the audience that I have is a global one that really reflects the African diaspora, largely in Latin America and the US. And for me, that's important because I think that it's important to connect our experiences together, because I think that there's a lot of power in us being able to recognize ways that we are experiencing white supremacy, global white supremacy, in similar and in some ways distinct ways. One of the ways that I study global white supremacy is actually by focusing on Black families in particular. So, for example, my first book, The Color of Love, was a book that was written to highlight how sometimes Black families treat their children differently based on what they look like racially, because they've internalized ideas about racial hierarchies. And in the same book, I also show how families can also engage in transgressive actions, ways that they can be anti-racist, even as they're grappling with how to navigate white supremacist ideas. My most recent book, Second Class Daughter, I think is probably most relevant to this conversation because that book is based on 10 years of data from me going back and forth to Brazil, both interviewing and observing women who are called filhas de criação, raised daughters. These are women who were taken in under the guise of adoption by wealthy and often white families, only to be treated like slaves in these adoptive families. And so the women start out as young girls, as young as 4 years old, but they are now 30, 50, even 70 years old, and they still continue to both labor and live in these slave-like conditions. So for me, what's unique about this book is that part of what I explore is the emotional manipulation that's also very key to domination. And so in this way, because of my focus on emotions and families, I think that there's a lot of synergy that I share with both Gevi and Octavia. So I'm looking forward to our conversation and exploring what those synergies are. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, Geveryl Robinson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Geveryl Robinson, and what I do and who I am are kind of intertwined. I'm an educator, I'm an activist, I'm an organizer, but who I am and what my passion is just truth. Some would say I'm a professional troublemaker. I get into good trouble, and I'll accept that. But my focus is on violent politeness, ruinous empathy, and getting to the ground truth as opposed to the official truth. And what I mean by that is the official truth is what we put out into the world. You know, all men are created equal in our, the ground truth is no, that's not exactly the case. You know, we have systemic issues, structural issues, but there's also an underground truth, which is the truth that is ignored, avoided, or feared. And in Florida, especially, I feel like the truth of Black people is underground right now, or they're trying to make it underground. They want to ignore it, they want to avoid it, probably because they fear it. They fear people knowing who we are as a people, what we've done in this nation, because an educated populace would never tolerate a lot of the racism and things like that. And I'll say briefly what got me so focused on violent politeness, ruinous empathy, and getting to the ground truth. I had a friend, well, I still have him. His name is Barry Wolf, Dr. Barry Wolf. He's a white man, he's Jewish. Grew up in Washington, D.C., but when he was born, he had a cleft palate. And because of the way he looked, people treated him differently. Like they would just look at him. They didn't know anything about him. They just look at him and they were like, I don't want to deal with him. He doesn't look like us. And because of that, he gravitated towards Black people. And he said that what it did was, even though he wasn't Black and he knew that, he understood what it felt like for someone to just look at you and automatically discount you or automatically say, you're not good enough, you're not whatever. So from that, growing up in Washington, D.C., he decided that when it was time for him to go to college, he was going to go to Howard University. And his father disowned him because he was like, no, you're not going to Howard University. But he ended up going, and he ended up integrating Howard University's basketball team. But through that experience, he went from 1959 to 1963. And seeing, which was a turbulent time in our country racially, it still is, but not like it was then. It changed his life. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, but he became a psychologist. And through that experience, he came up with these 5 E's for racial healing, which I'm going to talk about later. I'm going to leave you with that. You can ponder like, what are those? We'll talk about it.
Thank you, Gabby. All right, Octavia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Octavia Brown. Thank you for allowing me to be here today to, not only for me, but for everyone here to share our real life stories with you about challenging violent politeness. I am a native Floridian. I have been here my entire life, starting out in Central Florida, particularly the famous winter strawberry capital, Plant City, Florida. I did start out as a lawyer, however, in Jacksonville, Florida, and I began my legal career with the Florida Department of Children and Families as an attorney there. The Florida Department of Children and Families is tasked with protecting children from abuse, abandonment, or neglect. And I thought to myself, taking that job, that would be a wonderful place to work. I would be, helping out, helping families, keeping families strong, uniting families. But that was not the case. When I began my work there, I realized the harm that was happening to families, that we weren't truly keeping families together, that we weren't truly trying to keep, even in cases of actual abuse, abandonment, or neglect, we were not trying to keep children with their families. And I became discouraged and disillusioned, and I left the Department of Children and Families and transitioned over to being a parent attorney with the newly created Office of Criminal Conflict and Civil Regional Counsel. And I believe that was around 2008. That was there that I found my purpose. When I left the Department of Children and Families, they said to me, well, you're going over to the dark side. I said, well, whatever you want to call it. However, that was when I became a real lawyer. That was when I started advocating and really sort of zealously representing my client and protecting their constitutional rights, and trying to literally keep government out of families. And so I have been doing child dependency work since 2005 until now. I've been a child's attorney with the state of Florida Guardian Ad Litem program. And in 2016, I created my own private practice, and we represent parents and families that have been affected by the child dependency system. So today, I would like to talk to you about how it affects, violent politeness affects families in the court system and in their interactions with court personnel, and how that affects their family. And so I will turn it over to Gannett so she can move us along.
Thank you, Octavia. Thank you so much. You all are really doing some great work, and really appreciate the heart and the passion that you bring into your work and the advocacy for families, especially our Black families that are disproportionately impacted by these systems. So Elizabeth, you are in the process of writing a book on predatory inclusion. Can you talk a little bit about what prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, I will. And it's funny because as Octavia was talking, I think I realized the relevance of predatory inclusion for what she's talking about in ways that I didn't realize before. So let me first start off by saying I have this faculty position, but I also have been in 3 different senior level DEI positions at USF. All of them have been eliminated, and that happened over the last 3 years. And I think that speaks to what has happened to what we understand as the diversity, equity, inclusion, even anti-racism movement in this country. And so my writing this book on predatory inclusion was really about me processing what I experienced and the level of disposability that I felt after having put so much into these roles only to be disposed of. And I think this is just being blunt about this. But let me explain how researchers have used the term predatory inclusion. So predatory inclusion is not my term, but I'm using it in a bit of a different way. But it refers to when a member of a excluded or marginalized group finally gains access to something, an opportunity, a good or a service that they have not previously had access to before. But the conditions under which they receive access are so exploitative that it actually causes harm, that it actually, the harm that it causes undermines any long-term benefits that could come from having access. So historically, people like Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor does a beautiful job of writing about this. She writes about this as it relates to Black people and housing in the US. She has this book called Race for Profit. And she talks about how lenders post-1960s were supported by the government to give Black people access to mortgages. This sounds great. Let's give Black people the opportunity to accomplish the American dream. But they did this by offering them loans that they knew they could not replace, by accepting loans for properties that were dilapidated already, but that Black families moved into. And so essentially, this service was offered, but ultimately Black folks were not able to remain in their homes. Their homes were devalued. And so the investment into the mortgages or the home ownership of Black people was really about wealth extraction, whereas when money was given to white families, it was about wealth building. So this concept of predatory inclusion has really been percolating in my mind because it makes me think about what it means for Black women in particular to have access to roles and opportunities and leadership that they have not been able to have access to before. But the conditions are so problematic that the level of harm that they are facing undermines the benefits. And so I see that with my colleagues who are all also in DEI, but as Octavia mentioned, I think this idea of predatory inclusion, the idea of bringing Black people in to serve in a capacity where you think you're going to make a difference is really pernicious when you understand that what was really happening is that institutions sometimes want to respond to a situation, but they don't want to actually resolve the situation. And so predatory inclusion gives a language to be able to talk about the harm that we face and the perniciousness of systems that really work to extract labor and anything else that they can get from us and leave us in whatever state they leave us in, because our well-being is not part of the calculus that institutions are considering. So I think that it's important to have this conversation because it allows us to situate the complexities of these institutions. We are all well-meaning in many cases, but when you have systems that have been designed to undermine the success of particular groups and have been intentional about that, I think that this is where you see some of the conflict coming in. So my book is about both how Black women navigate this, but also how institutions have historically engaged in this type of practice for a long time, especially as it relates to Black people.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I can totally relate to that with, I spent 22 years in the child welfare system, and really after spending 20 years in the system and realizing that the needle had not moved, it really caused me to really look at my life and what I was doing. So we see these outcomes, these negative outcomes that harm our children and our families, in spite of the fact you may have a Black person that may be in a leadership position. I was in a senior leadership position. Yep. And in spite of that, we were still bringing children in, Black children in, separating them from their families at a higher rate. And it does take a personal toll on us who are in these positions, who really care, and we were drawn into it to make a difference. So thank you, Elizabeth. You're really highlighting in this book something that I think many of us who are of color and we're in these institutions are going to be able to relate to, because it really does feel predatory.
Yeah. And if I could just add one more thing before we transition, because I think that this is not a new phenomenon. Martin Luther King Jr. said something profound when he said, after reflecting on his work, I fear I may have integrated my people into a burning house. What we're feeling, this idea of predatory inclusion, is not new. It's something that we have to be able to also link to these historical moments. So I'm excited about what Gevi and Octavia have to offer to this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, Gevi. So the very first time you mentioned the term violent politeness, I was so intrigued. So talk to us a little bit about that.
All right. So what happened was back in 2021, I applied for this. It was a Faculty Excellence Award, and there was a grant involved. And I knew that I wanted to talk about violent politeness. Violent politeness is basically when you don't have the conversations that you need to have because you're scared, and that can lead to ruinous empathy where, a lot of times when, and I'm gonna put this under the umbrella of white people, because this all started with a conversation with a white woman named Jenny, which I'm going to get to. When, let's say, you're in a group of people and they're making racist jokes or whatever, and it's wrong, you may not even feel that way, but you don't say anything. You don't say anything because you're afraid of how you may look in the group, or you're afraid that, what somebody else might feel or whatever. And so in your own way, you empathize with whoever is being talked about, let's say Black people, but you don't do anything about it. And so this all came about when I was having a conversation with this woman named Jenny, who had gone into a Facebook group. It was primarily Black women. And they were just talking about racial issues. And she said, she talked about how she's for reparations, and, you know, she was married to a Black man and everything like that. And she said sometimes when she's out, if she sees Black people, she'll give them money as many reparations, right? And they just went berserk, like, wait a minute, you do what? And she didn't really understand what the issue was. She was like, that's a good thing, isn't it? And they were like, no, you have white guilt, you have a whole lot of things going on. And so they challenged her to talk to, they were like, we want you to talk to a Black person, but a Black woman in particular, to see if maybe you don't understand us, but maybe you'll understand her. So she contacted one of my friends to ask him if he knew of anyone. He's like, I have the perfect person. It was me. I recorded that conversation, and we spent an hour and a half, you know, talking. And what I appreciated about her, it was a tough conversation, but it needed to happen. And what I appreciated about Jenny, and I told her that, was her willingness to even have it. Because a lot of white women, let's just keep it 100, are not going to have that conversation. They're not going to talk about the fact, and this is the grant that I won, that the award, the very first line was 40% of white slave owners were women. You don't want to have that conversation. We don't want to have the conversation about the 1920s when people will say women got the right to vote. No, not all women. Certain women, Black women, had to wait a little while. And so there are conversations that need to happen that have not been happening. The official truth that is put out there for a lot of women is we're all together. We're all one. We all get along. We're one big happy family. The ground truth is, no, there's a division. And it's been there for centuries. And we need to get to the root, or as my grandma used to say, the root. Get down to the root of it. And have the conversations that need to be had. And stop getting to the underground truth. Stop ignoring or avoiding for fear, but really just make sure our official truth and our ground truth align.
Awesome. Thank you, Gevi. So Octavia, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, because you work in the system day in and day out. And I tell you, the first time I heard the terms violent politeness, predatory inclusion, it just took me immediately to the child welfare system. And there is a lot of, I think, secrecy, if you will, or people don't really understand, like, the violation of basic our constitutional rights, and just some of the challenges that our system causes to our families. So can you just talk a little bit, kind of the day in the life of, or how does this show up for you on a daily basis? Just talk to us a little bit about how these concepts show up in your work.
Sure. So in regard to violent politeness, you know, I thought about today, I deal with it every day. So when you're in court and you're with your client, and obviously most of the clients look like me, and they look like my family. And the child has been removed because they allege that the mother's home is not safe, or the father's home is not safe. And they place this child in foster care. And what we often find is that the Department of Children and Families, they're not providing timely services to the child. So they're alleging the child has been abused in some way. They're not providing the needed therapeutic services. The child may have educational needs. He's not being taken to school every day. A lot of children have IEPs. They're not attending IEP meetings. Parents are not giving notification for IEP meetings. I've seen autistic children who are not being routinely provided with needed medications and therapies that have been, the parents prior to the children being taken from the parents, were receiving routinely with parents. And so the violent politeness, in my opinion, is when we go to court and we explain this to the judge. DCF is not doing this. DCF is not doing this. This is the third time we've been to court about this. And so the response that we often get from the court is, oh, they'll do it. I'm sure. They're busy. It's okay. The next time we're here, they're going to do it. I'll order them to do it, and when we return the next time, it's never done. And so what happens when the issue is not being addressed by the court and the court is being polite to DCF, is that the children's reunification with the parents are being delayed. Parents who often also are not being receiving services are not sort of fixing the issues that brought the children into care. And they're continually, by being polite to DCF, giving the permission to continue with that behavior. In the reverse, if a parent engaged in those similar actions toward their children, that would cause an immediate red flag. It would sound the alarm. This is not a good parent. The child shouldn't be with them. And so that politeness towards Department of Children and Families, it affects families every day. Every week that I'm in court, that I hear I can't get the service, so I can't be reunified. And it causes a tremendous impact on children because they often want to return to their parents. And I have not seen in any instance, very few instances where a member of the judiciary is very sort of blunt with DCF about their inability to provide services, timely and effective services to parents. But that is how it affects my clients on a daily basis. It's every day. Anytime I'm in court, I've never been in court that I've heard where DCF has provided the needed services to parents on a timely basis in order to make sure reunification happens quickly rather than it being a delayed process.
Yeah, Octavia, I totally agree with that. And I think, what you're highlighting is kind of like that double standard where the system holds parents to a higher standard. And the irony is that the system is the one that has the resources. They have the money, they get what they need, they get more money every year from the legislators. You have families that are continuing to be more under-resourced just with the inflation, cost of living challenges. But in spite of that, it still seems like we hold parents to a higher standard, and the system does not hold itself to that same standard, if that's what I'm hearing. And I want to kick it back over to Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, you've done work in multiple countries. And I think I want you to just speak a little bit to what you've seen as far as kind of like that double standard when you're dealing with, in this situation, our Black families are the ones that are being held to a certain standard. They lose custody of their kids come into a system, and the system somehow gets a pass to do some of the very things that, or sometimes worse things that the parents were alleged to have done. Just talk a little bit about your work as a sociologist and how you have seen that show up.
Well, let me just go back to highlight something that Octavia mentioned, which is that what people don't realize. So on the surface, protecting children, everybody wants children protected, right? We all agree children should be protected. But what's interesting is that historically, Black people have been excluded from all of these types of social services. Today we have inclusion, but it's predatory, right? We're gonna provide you with these services, but just know that we're going to take your children at twice the proportion that we take white children. Just to give you a sense of this, only about 17% of children who are taken and moved into foster care are taken because of physical or sexual abuse. 17%. That leaves 83% of these kids, and many of them are taken not because of that, but because of, like Octavia was saying, actually determinations of neglect, right? And neglect can be framed so broadly that essentially what researchers like Dorothy Roberts, for example, who writes about this, argues is that families are being punished because they don't have socioeconomic resources. It's not that they're being abusive. And if people were actually honest about what was happening, they'd have to talk about the role of structural racism in shaping the resources or lack of resources that these families have access to. So we see this happening throughout the world. What we also see are similar stereotypes about Black people that help to substantiate the decisions, right? You see the tendency to frame Black children as being better off if they were with, not only better off if they were not with their families, and certainly better off if they were with white families, right? So we have all of these stereotypes about Black people's capabilities or abilities to provide support that are not rooted in data, and that often don't address some of the structural issues. And so it's incredible to see this play out across these different nations. And when you have a place like Brazil, where you have very few people like Octavia Brown who look like Octavia Brown in Brazil, it actually, you have even fewer advocates for these families. And so you have millions of people really on their own trying to navigate a system that was not designed to support them.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. So, Gevi, when you were talking earlier, you said something that really struck me about 40% of the slave owners being white women. And I think when you shared that with me, it was the first that I had heard of that. And I want you to just talk a little bit more about that and how that shows up in some of, in the discussion that we're having right now. You're on mute if you're talking. You're still on mute.
I had to post this. There was a conversation on Twitter. I can't even remember how it got started, but a white woman was posting about slavery, and what she kept talking about were the men. The men did this, the men did that, the men did that. And I posted, being me, 40% of white slave owners were women. And I posted the link from history.com, then I posted something else. And then underneath mine, Black people were like, thank you, didn't know that. She never said another word, right? And so the thing that I think, well, I don't think it happens, that happens is a lot of white women, there's a very famous photo where they're women, there's a, I guess a march or something out in Washington, D.C. And there's a Black woman, she has on a cap and she's sucking on a lollipop and she's holding a sign that said, remember, white women voted for Trump, right? And all these white women, she's surrounded by white women, they have on their little pink cat hats, you know what I'm talking about. And she's just standing there sucking on the sucker like, because 53% voted for him, like voted against. So you can't really say that we're all together, we're united, when you know that your vote is going to be detrimental to Black women, Black people, but Black women. You know what I'm saying? So the whole notion, again, it's these conversations that we need to have that nobody wants to talk about. Black women were largely excluded during the suffragist movement. We had to wait, okay? Estee Lauder got rich. They were wearing the red lipstick, okay? But for us, a lot of times, if you were a Black woman who wore your bright red lips or whatever, you were considered to be, again, I'm gonna go to my grandma, a floozy. You know, they're like, you want a fast girl. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, part of the problem that I see is that a lot of white women really don't know Black women. They just don't. A lot of white people really don't know Black people, which is why what my friend Barry did, I think, was so important, and how he came up with, because one of those 5 E's is exposure. You know, how do you, he said that he wanted to figure out why people hated Black people so much. Okay, how you figure that out? You go be with Black people. You look at his own father, but he's like, I want to know. He said it has to be more than just the way they look. It can't, you know, are they this, are they that? Let me go see for myself. Let me expose myself. A lot of people aren't going to do that, but then they'll have opinions about who we are when they've never even been exposed. They've been exposed to what the media tells them, or, you know, what somebody else, somebody may have had one bad experience and now it's all of us, you know. Or if they've had an experience. I think it's interesting that Black people are the only group of people who have to be excellent. You never hear about white excellence, Asian excellence. This is a Black, we have to be excellent. We've all heard the expression, you have to be twice as good to get happy. I mean, we've heard it. We're the only, you know, why is that? And we've internalized that as well, you know. But yeah, a lot of it is that 1E exposure that I don't believe a lot of white women really have with Black women, not on a deep level.
So true.
If they did, they wouldn't vote against us.
Well, you know, I think I love what you are saying about the lack of real relationships with Black women, because I think that this also speaks to this idea of performative allyship, right? This idea is that when you aren't connected to Black people in real life, folks are seeking for ways to signal that they kind of believe in a cause, but they don't, without actually having to connect with Black people at all. One of the things that whenever you present on this, Gevi, I love when you talk about violent politeness, because it reminds me of this book, The Price of Nice. And it was written by Angelina Castagno, and she basically brings together a bunch of writers who write about the dangers of this, right? So part of the way that we can understand niceness is connected to emotions. What type of emotion work is white people engaged in? Are they engaged in to feel like they have to be nice and even sometimes overly nice? What is it that you're trying to manage there? And what the book suggests is that there's some guilt that's there. There's a desire to be a good person in the context of a society when you know that white supremacy and racism exists, but you're trying to frame yourself in a positive way. And unfortunately, the price of nice is that there are lots of people who are suffering. This book talks a lot about the educational system, where teachers who are overwhelmingly white women are sometimes so invested in being nice that they're not willing to work to address real issues. Instead of kind of challenging narratives about George Washington, it's nicer and easier to just kind of tell that narrative and not really talk about where his wooden teeth came from and what enslaved Africans had to do with that. So it's easier. Let's just be nice and keep the temperature light. And I think that they are part of what you're pointing to, Gevi, is that there's a time and place for a lot of things. And at this point, we are at a crisis moment where we have to be able to have these conversations, and folks have to have the emotional maturity to be able to feel the emotions that come with that, accept that these are the emotions that you're feeling, but still stay connected to the conversation so we can move from conversation to action. And that's easier said than done around these topics.
Yes, let me just say this about the word nice, because I love words and I love looking up the etymology. The word nice, when it first came into the lexicon, means ignorant. It meant ignorant. It wasn't until a few centuries later that it changed to what we know now. So maybe when they're being nice, they really are. You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying.
You just reframed all of that. No, that's good. You know what, the other thing that I think is connected to niceness, and this connects it back to predatory inclusion, is that folks don't have sometimes the knowledge to even know where to start with these conversations, right? So if we're talking about what kids are being taught in school and they're going to be taught even less about this in school. If the subject of, for example, race and racism comes up, white people in particular who have oftentimes been sheltered from this information feel kind of like, okay, this is all new to me. I don't know what to say here. I don't want to say the wrong thing. But I think that this is also connected to giving people the tools to be able to understand history so that they can even have a starting point. And unfortunately, as it relates to Florida, with some of the legislation that's passing, my fear, and the fear of lots of folks, is that tenuous knowledge base that folks have now is going to recede even further, because they're going to get less of the truth telling that is important to us really being able to change things. You know, when Octavia talks about family separation, we're talking a whole lot right now about Black families. But I think what's so important is for us to be able to connect family separations of Black families to what happened to Indigenous children who were stolen from their families and forced to go to these Indian boarding schools. We can talk about how in 2018, the US government didn't know what happened to 1,500 migrant children that they just lost. So I say this to say that when we center understanding Black stories and Blackness, it gives us a lens to be able to understand all of these different groups. It gives us a way to understand the structures at play that are structuring the experiences of so many marginalized groups.
Yes, for sure. And what's interesting too is that when children were separated at the border, there was a lot of outcry. You had like all these different like American Psychological Associations and all these associations that talked about the damage of that, but they're radio silent when it comes to the daily separation. And you're right, Elizabeth, nationally, Black and Native American children are disproportionately separated. Here in our community, because we don't have such a large volume of Native American children, we see that disparity primarily with the Black children. But so there is a lot of niceness. There's a lot of niceties. If you attend any of our child welfare meetings, there's a lot of glossy charts and pie charts and great pleasant conversation. But it is an extremely violent act to separate a child from its mother. And what's interesting, and Octavia, I'm going to just maybe have you shed a little bit of light because you work directly with these parents. I used to be an investigator with the Department of Children and Families, so I know exactly what it's like to walk into a home and walk out with a child. I think you have to, your average person, I don't think really understands that. And what's interesting in this system is that it is predominantly women that work within the system. So it's kind of like that paradox that there is a lot of the niceties and the politeness, but it's such a violent act. And a lot of the women who work in the system are mothers. And somehow there's like this disconnect where they know how they would feel if someone were to enter their own home, offer some type of judgment about something that they may or may not have done to their child, and walk out with a child that they actually birthed. But Octavia, I know you see this day in and day out, and I just want you to be able to just shed a little bit of light about what actually happens when we have those separations, or whatever you choose to share.
Right. So, I think that society as a whole, they know very little about the dependency system. They hear abuse, abandonment, or neglect, and they immediately think, well, those kids need to be saved. And why I'm saying that is because I think that when children are removed, this goes back to historical stereotypes about Black women, that we can't raise our children properly. They need to be in a better place anyway. The child is better off outside of the mother's care. And I think that those stereotypes about Black families and Black women affect why children are removed. Often I see my clients, we walk into a court and it is literally an emergency process. They come and rip these children out of the home sometimes without clothes, without anywhere to place them. And my client is crying and trying to explain to me what is happening and what has happened. A lot of times I can't make sense of it because I'm reading an entirely different story on the piece of paper in front of me. And it is often sometimes after I'm able to pull apart these cases that I realize a lot of things they've said about this woman's parenting of her child is untrue. Yep. But it's very difficult. It is extremely difficult to get the members of the judiciary to see this. And what has affected me greatly, and without saying the name of the member of the judiciary, they literally said in an open meeting that when DCF decides to take a child, that they believe that their actions were correct. Like, why would they take a child unless a child needed to be taken out of the home? Wow. That member of the judiciary obviously didn't look like me. And it confirmed my belief that they believe that if they take our kids, it's because they need to be taken. And, it is very emotionally draining, for everyone involved dealing with this process. And, but I think people are blind to the harm that it causes the child. If you take a child from a home from their parents and you place them in the home of a stranger, and that child will never get over that trauma of removal. And I tell them that all the time when I'm meeting with them, like, you can never undo this. Think about what you're doing before you decide to remove a child from their parent. And but Gannett knows, it's like sometimes you're like, we're saying these things, 20 years we've been saying these things to groups of people, rooms of people, about the harm that it is causing to Black and brown families. No one is hearing us. It's like no one is hearing us. But it is, we have to keep going. We have to keep moving and putting this out there, that the harm that is occurring to Black and brown families because of these stereotypical beliefs about our ability to parent, or about a father. And another point, let me make this. If a father may not be in the home, there is an automatic assumption that he's an absent Black father. Automatically. There is no looking for him to find out if he can take custody of his child. There's an assumption that he is not financially solvent. I mean, there are a lot of assumptions that happen on the first day I get to court about a Black man parenting his child. Immediately. And if I happen to have that Black male as a client, where we're fighting just to say that, yes, I can take my child and raise my child. I don't need you in my life. So that is another thing that harms families, that violent politeness, that we come forward and there's an assumption because something has happened to a bad with one parent, that this Black male can't parent his child. And so we have to vet him out until we think it's okay to place his child with him. So it is a tough fight every day. And but it's a fight that I'm willing to do. So
to keep going, Octavia. I mean, we have to keep at it until we actually see some change. I see Gabby and Elizabeth have both come off mute, so I don't know who wants to go first.
While Octavia was talking, I had to I kept thinking about, do you all remember Devontae Hart? Okay, this happened in 2014 when Mike Brown was murdered. There was a picture that went, it was a little Black boy hugging a police officer and he's crying, and it went all around the world. It went everywhere. Well, Devontae and his 5 siblings were later, that was in 2014. In 2018, the 2 white women, Jennifer and Sarah Hart, who had adopted all of them, they drove them off a cliff. It was a murder-suicide, and they killed all the kids. And people had been complaining on their behalf, like, something's not right here, something's not right here. But because of the appearance, they were like, no, everything's fine. This is like what you were saying, Octavia, to the point where it just breaks my heart. And it's difficult for me to look at that picture of Devontae now, because people were thinking, oh, he just wants racial healing, when really he probably just wanted help. And when people wanted him to be on talk shows, his moms were like, oh, no. Now I get it, because they were afraid of what he might actually say. But it just, again, as you were talking, I kept thinking about that, and how people will ignore what's in front of them if they feel like the visual is what's best for the kids.
Absolutely. There are just so many thoughts that I had, Octavia, after listening to you. And I think one of the thoughts is, I think it's important for people watching this to understand what we mean when we talk about this kind of history of family separation, how this is just part and parcel to how Black families have been dealt with. I'm talking specifically about Black families. And typically people get slavery, right? Mothers were separated from their children. Even after they gave birth, the children would be somewhere else. They often would be malnourished while the women were out working. They'd be waiting to get back to their baby, wanting them to survive. What folks don't sometimes realize is that even after slavery, white people would argue that Black children who were with their free parents were not being taken care of properly. So they would advocate to have those children come right back and be enslaved by them, with the argument that they could raise them and take care of them better. This goes at the heart of what you're saying, Octavia, is that the state was willing to send these Black kids back into enslavement because they felt that that was better than having them live with their family. And certainly they never thought of the idea of empowering these families and giving them access to resources so that they could provide those things. But even after that, when we think about the Great Migration in the early 1900s, families left the South to go up north, but that was also a type of family separation because Black folks were striving to get better opportunities, leaving their families in search for a place where they believed they could be successful. Even with Jim Crow, Black people had to leave to find areas in the small areas where they could work to be able to support their families. You have mass incarceration, you have redlining, all of these things in the kind of historical trajectory of the United States speak to the fact that family separation and this kind of the acceptance that Black families can and should be separated has been part of how we've understood Black families. So what you're talking about, the stereotypes that undergird the assumptions that people have about Black families' abilities and willingness are all part of that. And that's even when we have data otherwise. You just gave a great example. What the data tells us is that non-custodial Black fathers are the most involved fathers of any racial group. Those are the dads who are most involved. But it sounds like the court system has already accepted a certain narrative about who these men are and they're not even engaging the data, which we know is the best practice. So it's disturbing, and I think that these conversations are part of kind of raising awareness about it. And I think that the more we do this, the more we can start coming up with solutions that have to be not just individuals, but really at the structural and systemic level.
Yeah, it really is, because children need families. I mean, when we really look at our role as adults in this community is to create a world that our children can live in. And if you can attack the family structure, that really has lifelong implications for children. We do have children that have been successful in spite of the harm that the system has caused, but we also have longitudinal studies that show the long-term outcomes of children who have been separated, especially during those critical years of bonding and attachment. What's interesting is that oftentimes you'll hear of cases where the child has been taken from a parent, placed with a foster or an adoptive home, and they make that argument about bonding and attachment to justify not returning the child back to the family. And I'm like, okay, well, where is that same argument of bonding and attachment when you separated this child from the parent to begin with? You know, it's like the system is not really operating with what we know to be true with science. So this discussion is really important, and I'm really hoping that it can really spark a series of discussions throughout our country to really look at what is happening, not only within the system, but you mentioned mass incarceration. That is yet another way of family separation where we're removing adult parents of children away from the homes, which could cause lifelong implications for those children. So I really appreciate just all the honesty and the candid feedback. And I just want to open it up, though, to see if either one of you have any other. I know I want to transition to maybe some solutions or some call to action. But before we do that, are there any other thoughts that you all would like to share?
I feel like anytime you ask me that, I always have other things to share.
Go at it, Elizabeth.
One of the things I want to share is part of the truth telling is that when we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about the child welfare system, these systems have not developed coincidentally. And we have to tell the truth about how folks actually understood what would happen when they designed a system like this. And I think this is the scary part. So when we start talking about solutions, we're also functioning under the assumption that we're all on the same, our society's on the same page about who we want to have to be successful. We are assuming that we want everybody to be successful. And I think that some of these assumptions that we have are not correct. And that's a hard pill to swallow. And so I think that we have to balance how we talk about solutions with the reality of where we are. And I think that that's sometimes difficult to navigate. And I don't have an easy solution to this. But what I do know is that we have to be willing to entertain the fact that the system could actually be functioning exactly as it was designed to function. and that it's not broken.
Exactly. And you know, the irony in all this is that all of us are the same. When you look at families, those of us who, you know, I've been involved in the system for years, and a lot of the challenges when you look at domestic violence, substance abuse, neglect, just everything that happens in the families who are under scrutiny also occur in families of all socioeconomic statuses. It all, so, you know, it's kind of like the big lie that, you know, we have to treat this group of families different, particularly our Black families, or families experiencing poverty, when those of us who are on the system side are able to navigate and manage those very same issues within our families without that fear of family separation. So
Yep.
that is when, you know, Gevi mentioned the underground truth. The underground truth is that we all aren't treated equally. There's a different standard for certain parents, and everyone knows that parenting is not a perfect science, you know, so things happen, people make mistakes, they make errors in judgment. Not everyone is going to agree with what I may do as a parent. But it's like, who has the power to come in and judge someone else's parenting style and actually walk out with a child that they birthed? I mean, it's really, that's where that honesty, and we have to be honest about what is occurring in all families, not just the families that are under the microscope.
Yeah, and this is exactly, I think that perspective is important because it allows us to also understand governmental response to, for example, the crack epidemic versus the opioid crisis, right? Which people deserve medical treatment and which people are just criminals who just do those types of things because that's how they are. I mean, it's night and day how we see that we have actually the structures necessary to help people and to treat people if we view these people as treatable. And I think certain groups are treatable, others are throwaways, are disposable. And what's interesting, I think that the hard pill that I'm processing in my book is that your class status and your education status does not protect you from being disposable. And this is the hard reality too, that I think we are faced with, grappling with. The same people who are trying to solve the problem are also facing their own kind of issues. So it kind of compounds.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Gevi, did you have anything? I saw that you were off mute. Anything to add to this conversation?
Not, I'm waiting for the solutions. I got you on that.
All right, so that's a great segue. So Gevi, we're gonna start with you. Let's talk about, what are some things, some practical things? What are some call to action? Let's leave the folks with something.
Okay, so remember I told you that my friend Barry Wolf had 5 E's, right? For racial healing. First one is exposure. The second is education. People are ignorant about, you know, you can't come together with people if you're ignorant about who they really are. But also, again, it speaks to trying to stifle the education about Black people in this country. I always say Black history is American history. You cannot talk about America without talking about Black people and what we've contributed. And I'm not just talking about climbing up the rough side of the mountain and overcoming. I'm talking about our inventions, our creations, the food, like everything we touch, okay? Everything you look at, even right now, we have had a hand in that. So there has to be education. The next thing, if you have exposure and you're educated, then you're going to understand equality a little bit better. That's that next E. The issue is people don't want to be educated. They're not exposed or don't want to be, so they don't want to be. And actually, getting back to something I think Elizabeth said, I don't think a lot of people want to be equal. Because if you're equal, that means you can't be above somebody. And there's that hierarchy. We understand, we know what's going on. Number 4, empathy. With my friend Barry, even though, like I said, he doesn't know what it's like to be Black, but he knows what it's like to be treated differently just because you don't look like somebody else. And because of that, that made him empathetic. And then being on the basketball team in the 50s, early 60s, going to places of play, seeing how his teammates couldn't do certain things that he could do just because he was white, it caused him to be empathetic. And I think a lot of times, again, it's the exposure, the education, the empathy, and the equality all together, but it's also that 50 is experience. You can be exposed to someone, but that doesn't mean you experience them. You're exposed. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so all of those things, with him being at Howard, he said it wasn't just an exposure. I experienced so many things that I never would have, even being on the outside, even though I said I was cool with Black people, I had to be right in the thick of it to experience all of what I experienced in order for me to understand and really have the knowledge to be able to go out to other people. I always say this, Black people cannot solve racism. We didn't start it. You know, it seems like they come to us to try to get us to talk to white people. But let me ask you, in what time in history has there ever been a problem and they're like, let's go ask Black people? You know, they will listen to them. Don't listen to us. So you have to have white people who are not allies, who are accomplices. OJ just died, but we need some Al Collins, some AC Collins, you know, white Bronco driving white folks who are going to put in the work to do what needs to be done. And I'll end with this. Last week I was speaking at a conference and there was a white man in there. We were talking about Black history and about this. And he said, how do you change, asking me, how do you change people's hearts? You know, how do you get them to want to do things? And I said, you don't. I can't change anyone. People have to want to change themselves. They have to go on that journey, just like with Barry, he was like, I need to understand why this is, why people, and until people really hold that mirror up and say, you know what, there's some things I need to change, just like Jenny, you know, she asked me, how can I be racist when I was married to somebody Black? I'm like, the same way a serial killer, you know, can have friends and family who are still alive. You're still a serial killer. You know, you just pick and choose. So people, you have to just let people come to things on their own. And if they don't, keep it moving.
Thank you, Gabby. All right, Octavia.
Yes. So the call to action for what I do is legal advocacy for parents. So what often happens is a parent receives this knock from their door. They open it and here's this child protective investigator sitting there, oftentimes with a member of the sheriff's department, asking them personal questions about their parenting, their children, and who comes in and out of their home. And these parents who are shocked when they are having to speak with these child protective investigators and answer these sort of rapid fire questions, are saying things that could possibly affect them having custody of their child. They're trying to be honest, but they're also trying to be protective. And without sort of the guidance that they need, once they engage in contact with this child protective investigator, they oftentimes are misled to say the wrong things in order for the child protective investigator to have the sort of evidence they need to remove their children. And so what I see from my own experience is that if a parent who has been accused of abuse, abandonment, or neglect has the guidance of an attorney in an investigative phase to represent them, and I don't have the numbers here in front of me, but it dissuades the child protective investigator from sort of having sort of unfettered access to the life of that parent and that child. It also helps to the parent to prevent sort of the removal of the child. So when a mother, for example, is a victim of domestic violence and she has done what she needed to do to protect herself and her child, she's called the authorities in order to have the perpetrator apprehended. What we see in the child dependency system oftentimes is that the mother is then victimized by the system. So her child is removed because they claim, well, domestic violence happened in the home and the child must be affected by it. Or, you know, this happened twice and, you know, you haven't done enough because it happens twice, but she's done everything appropriately that she should have done. And so they're victimized once by the perpetrator and then again by the system. And then the child then is victimized by the foster care system. But the point I'm saying is that in a case, for example, like domestic violence for a mother who needs that advocacy because she's already probably worn out emotionally dealing with being a victim. And then also now you have a child protective investigator. She needs that buffer of protection to help her navigate what is happening. And what we see is that an attorney in that emergency phase of an investigation can assist that parent so that child is not removing, or even if that mother may need some assistance, that it doesn't rise to the level of removal, that an attorney can help obtain services for her that are beneficial for her and protective for her and the child. And so parents need more legal advocacy to help protect them from the system that is unfortunately geared toward separating the children from families and really not helping families. So that would be my call to action.
Thank you, Octavia. And I just want to add, you know, what we've seen as we've been sharing with parents what their rights are. Many parents know what their rights are if they were to get pulled over by law enforcement, but they don't really know what their rights are when DCF knocks on the door. So I think empowering parents and giving them that information so they are aware is also important. But that legal advocacy piece, that's something that Octavia and I are working closely on. We're hoping to have something, have opportunity in Hillsborough County for parents that have access to legal counsel at the point that the investigator knocks on the door. And I just also want to add before I shift to Elizabeth that it's the lowest legal standard. You know, people think that there has to be all these dramatic things that the state has to demonstrate before they can take a child from your home, but it's actually a very low legal standard. It's fairly easy to draft a petition. You could probably go into anyone's home at any given point in time and draft something that a judge will sign off on. So that's another challenge that we have. And it's such a huge, I would imagine that a parent would rather get charged criminally than to lose custody of their child. I mean, so it's kind of, you know, you have this legal standard criminally up here, and then to lose custody of your kid, it's fairly low. So a lot of systemic challenges that lie ahead. All right, for us to address. All right, Elizabeth, what solutions do you have?
Well, I want to start by going back to predatory inclusion. If we know that this happens, what's the solution? I want to give you an example of a potential solution that's in action right now. So one of the ways that researchers have talked about predatory inclusion is to give the example of Black students and student debt. So Black students take out more student debt than anybody. And in fact, they are settled with so much student debt that it exacerbates the racial wealth gap. It makes it hard for Black couples, Black individuals to buy homes. It makes it hard for them to have economic stability because they're trying to do the right thing to get access to college, but they're saddled with these debt. So one of the researchers, a group of researchers, Seamster and Sharon Chevier, I think is his name, drafted a proposal for what could happen. And what they said is that loans should be forgiven for students who make a certain category of money. Long story short, you all have probably been following some of the decisions that Biden has made as it relates to student loan forgiveness. He's forgiven a substantial amount of loans. And that comes in part because it's been informed by some of that research that says to help folks, you're going to have to infuse resources and funding to support the people who have been harmed by practices. This was a pretty massive success in terms of this forgiveness program. A lot of the Republicans, and you probably have followed this, did not want to agree to this. And in fact, even with the framing, they've been cautious not to talk as much about how it can address some of the racial disparities, because they knew that if people know that Black people will benefit, they actually, even though it benefits everybody, they're less likely to vote for it. So it was passed, and you have students of all different backgrounds benefiting from this, and especially Black students who have been uniquely impacted by this. So I say that to say, we have so many resources in this country. We have money to give to wars, billions of dollars to dedicate to the things that we say are important. And folks love to talk about children. The children are our future. Invest in the children, children this, children that. I think that we really need to completely overhaul this system. Legal representation is great, but I think the bigger thing that you're saying is that this whole system is predicated on these problematic ideas, and even kind of outdated approaches that need to be revisited. And I think part of that is also addressing the way that structural racism is impacting the families that are disproportionately impacted by these child removals. And we can just listen to the data. We have really compelling data that talks about how poverty is being punished. If the issue is not having enough resources, then why don't we talk about empowering parents, providing them with opportunities, giving them subsidized resources that might help them provide their kids with the type of housing that we've decided is so vital to families. So, and I think part of that, to get there, how do we get there? I think we have to mobilize. And the mobilization right now looks like going to the polls, at least immediately. But there's a broader mobilization that needs to happen around the type of future that we want in this country. And that may mean completely rethinking these traditional systems that we've long become accustomed to, but are not servicing us in the way that they need to, and are not moving this country forward. So
absolutely.
yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think, having these discussions and really, having this honest discussion is really a step in the right direction, because we're not going to be able to have systems that actually support families and strengthen families until we're able to readily acknowledge the harm that's being caused by the current system. And, so for me, I just want to say something to the mothers that may be listening to us, and I guess the fathers too, but especially mothers. I know mothers who really believe that they know what's best for their children. It's a child that they birthed, and they believe that they know what's best. So I want you to think about, for those of you who believe that the government is needed to tell another parent what they think is best, maybe start thinking about what are your underlying beliefs about that other parent. Because what we see in the child welfare system is that many people in the system feel it's okay to treat other parents in a way that they would not appreciate being treated. So I think that's where that underground truth that Gevi was talking about, the only way that we're going to change is to really peel back the layers of what we believe about other people. So if you are not okay with someone from the government coming into your home, making a judgment about something you've done with your kid, and walking out of your house with your child that you birthed, what is it that you believe about the mother down the street that you believe that that treatment is okay? As Elizabeth mentioned, the system is not separating children, for the most part, that are being viciously physically abused or sexually abused. The overwhelming is neglect, where there's a huge level of subjectivity that's associated with that, and a judgment, right? So I just want you to dig deep and really think about, what are your underlying beliefs about these parents that are being subjected to this system that is extremely violent. There's nothing more violent than separating a baby from its parents. I mean, there's just not. So thank you all. Before we close, are there any last words that you all want to share? And I hope this is the beginning of many conversations. I'm curious, for those of you who are listening to us, any comments, feedback, what are your thoughts? I mean, this is really, we're going to need to have these raw, honest discussions to really create a system that's going to work for our families. Any last words before we close? All right. Well, once again, thank you, ladies. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your honesty. And we're going to have to keep fighting the good fight and see what lies ahead for our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.